Engage your brain and enter the mind's eye. I'm your host, Brian Turnov, and you're listening to Z Talk Radio. In just a couple days, you're going to celebrate Christmas, and many of you will include the usual traditions. By now, if you're lucky to have them, of course, your trees are lit, the stockings are stuffed, and you're waiting patiently next to the fireplace with your milk and cookies for Santa, and you have a little candy cane in your mouth. And as an outsider looking in, my favorite tradition is the ugly sweater contest. It just gets worse and worse every year. But the most important tradition, of course, is spending time with your family. Although this is our third year, this is our first Christmas special, and I hope that from here on out, you'll make the mind's eye part of your tradition, and really part of your family. And hopefully the same way that I've welcomed you and always leave an empty chair here for you at our digital table. And while you're sitting down on your own real chair tonight, hopefully you're very comfortable, take a peek outside your window and you'll probably see a nativity scene depicting the birth of Jesus Christ. And really, that's really what the holiday is all about, isn't it? And I'm sure you've heard the story by now. Jesus was born to Mary, a virgin mother. And technically, outside of artificial insemination, that is an actual possibility. You can get a woman pregnant without penile penetration. I'll save the details for you, just look it up. Even the most ardent Catholic and Christian has to question this basic tenet of Catholicism. If Jesus wasn't really born to a virgin mother, then who is his father and what's the real story behind his birth? Our guest, just a mere 6 months after his last visit, is Graham Phillips, who has been investigating historical mysteries for over 20 years. He's going to help us unwrap this riddle and provide you with an alternative view on Jesus Christ and his birth to a virgin mother. That's not the only puzzling gift Graham and I will unwrap for you this evening. We're going to explore another 2,000-year-old holy mystery. You're going to discover what really happened to the Virgin Mary after the crucifixion of Jesus, and where her final resting place may actually be. All of these thought-provoking questions and explorations are featured in Graham's two books, The Virgin Mary Conspiracy and The Chalice of Magdalene. Even better, this is the first time Graham has ever done an interview on this subject. You're probably ready to tear open that wrapping paper. Your gift after a quick word from our sponsor. This is The Mind's Eye. I can't imagine you not being in the Christmas spirit by now, but hopefully not quite in the same way as a few recent Guatemalan protesters who were burning cardboard depictions of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump wearing devil horns during their annual Christmas tradition of the burning of the devil. The ceremony started in the 1500s, and participants believed that the practice of torching the devil helps banish bad spirits from their homes and neighborhoods. Please, no burning of anything except for Yule logs this year. Get the full article and so much more at our Facebook and Twitter pages, facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show, our Twitter handle @Mind's Eye Show. Now, if you want to hear our last interview from 6 months ago with Graham on the lost tomb of King Arthur, go to themindseyemedia.com. You'll find a complete set of free archives, blog, and so much more. Again, that's at themindseyemedia.com. Your auditory Christmas present coming up next, the answer to some of the greatest mysteries in church history. Join historical detective Graham Phillips and I after this quick commercial break. This is The Mind's Eye. I call him Sherlock Jones, Indiana Holmes. You can call him historical detective Graham Phillips. You're all over the place. Thanks so much for joining us tonight on The Mind's Eye.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Pleasure as always. And I've seen you all over the place in the past 6 months, which I can't believe it's gone by so quickly since our last interview. You've had a bit of a better year, I'd like to think. I see you everywhere now.
Yes, well, since the King Arthur... I was out of circulation for a good few years, but I've been doing a load of research now, and I've been doing the publicity for the King Arthur book, and at the moment I have been working on the search for the Ark of the Covenant, which has been getting a lot of publicity. I haven't found it yet, but I'm kind of doing an online search, so in other words, as I go along, people can see me doing it as and when, posting photographs and snippets of film as I go along. So that's fascinating stuff.
So people can actually take the quest with you in a regard, in some way.
And advise me. I'm having a lot of help from people on Facebook and things. I mean, this didn't exist when I used to do research in the old days. It was me out there in a library or interviewing archaeologists and historians. Now I've got loads of people saying, oh, I found this out. Do you know this? Did you realise that? And it's making it a very exciting quest altogether. And it's all being filmed as we go along. So at the end of it, I can put it all together as a video.
Do we have an expected time of when that's going to come out, or just going to let it kind of gestate and come out naturally?
Sort of do its own thing at the moment. I'm sort of hoping that by next spring we'll have something solid. But at the moment, it's just basically got a mind of its own.
Just going to let it breathe and let it take where it goes, and that's what I love about you. You don't really put your own biases into all these searches that you do into these mysteries. You just let the evidence take you where it's going. That's what I appreciate about you.
It's something I can do, not being an academic. I mean, I'm not attached to any university or official body, so I can do whatever I like. And I find a mystery that grabs my attention, and I think, I'm going to see where that goes. If I was associated with any organisation, I'd have to have some kind of structure to it to say, we are trying to prove this or that, or disprove this or disprove that. I'm just going with the flow, and that's what I find so fun about it.
And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to focus on your book, The Marian Conspiracy, and I'll let you take that away in a moment. But before we get into it, of course, when we're talking about it, we're here to celebrate Christmas. So first of all, let me just say Merry frickin' Christmas to you, my friend. And and what do you got planned for a couple days from now at Christmas?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it, to be quite honest. I'm not really a Christmas type of person. I'm more the bar humbug, sort of sit down and get some work done while everybody else is sort of off doing whatever they do. So I will probably do my accounts.
Okay.
Like Scrooge, with his little mittens on, with his, with the end of the gloves cut off, with his fingers and just one log on the fire, doing his accounts at Christmas. I might do that, actually.
It doesn't sound too terrible. I'll be having a Jewish Christmas. I'll be eating my Chinese food and watching some movies. So we'll be on separate sides of the pond doing our own little Christmas thing. And that's what we're going to plan to do tonight. We're going to celebrate Christmas. But, of course, we're going to do that the mind's eye way, Graham. And that's going to tear everything down and rebuild it back up and question everything that we know that we've been told. And we're going to focus on, like we said before, the Marian Conspiracy, which gives a bit of an alternative view of the life of Jesus, his mother, and the followers. And what we talk about tonight, some may even consider a bit blasphemous. Do you feel that what we're doing here is blasphemous?
Yes and no. I don't find it blasphemous, and most of the people that I know who are religious don't find it blasphemous. Because all I'm simply doing is pointing out to people what is in the Bible. Anything I say tonight will be as it is recorded in the Bible, unless I state otherwise, and then I will tell you where exactly the information is coming from. In other words, what documentation from the early Christian period this is found. So all I'm doing is reporting what's already out there.
And Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, of course, is one of the most debated and even mysterious figures in Catholicism and in the Bible. And tonight, we're going to paint a couple different pictures of her. One from the Bible, which you're talking about, and one that we're going to extend a bit more. And really the best place to start when talking about the Mother of Jesus Christ is Bible. What exactly does the Bible say about Mary, I guess, pre-crucifixion? Let's start there. I mean, how is she introduced to the readers in the Bible, and really what does it tell us about her?
Well, one of the things that you mentioned that my book is called The Marian Conspiracy. In America, it's published as The Virgin Mary Conspiracy. And the reason I mention this is the reason they call it that in England is the word Marian means of Mary, belonging to Mary. So within the church now, the Catholic Church, there is something called the cult of Marian, which basically isn't a kind of cult of people going off and doing strange things. It simply means people who pay devotion to the Virgin Mary. Now, Catholics tend to do that Protestants don't so much. So why is Mary so important to Catholics, particularly? In the Bible, she is brought into the story as when she conceives miraculously. In other words, she has not had relations with a man. She's not even married to Joseph, and suddenly she finds she's pregnant. Joseph does the good thing and marries her because he already knows her, although he seems to be somewhat older than her. And then she eventually bears Jesus. We're told in one of the Gospels that it is the angel Gabriel that appears to her and tells her that God is going to make her fertile with a child. The child will be the Son of God. Now, okay, that's pretty big claim. So she gives birth as a virgin, and that's why she's called the Virgin Mary. My own belief is that this story was possibly added on later on about her being a virgin. Now, the reasons for this are that there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament, 4 separate accounts of Jesus' life. 2 of them don't even mention the miraculous birth. It just starts off with Jesus' teachings, which makes you somewhat suspicious. What makes me further suspicious is that the Old Testament, the ancient Jewish scriptures, foretold the coming of a Messiah, somebody who would unite all the Jewish people to throw off the yoke of oppression at the time Jesus was alive, that being the Romans who occupied what's now Israel. Now, what happened was that an ancient prophet had foretold that the Messiah would be born of an Alma. That is the word in Hebrew. Now, the word Alma means a maiden or unmarried woman. In other words, the Messiah would be born from an unmarried woman. Now, why would that be important? It was telling us that when the Messiah came to unite the Jewish people, he would be born of a very humble birth. He would start at humble beginnings. His mother wouldn't even be married, which would be one of the most, something would really put you in most people's bad books back at those times. So it says, he shall be born of a Alma, a maiden, unmarried woman. But when the Gospels were written, they were written by people in Greek. The first people to start writing the stories about Jesus were Greek followers of Jesus. And so the Gospels were originally written in Greek. Somebody obviously mistranslated the word for Alma, thinking it didn't mean a maiden, an unmarried woman, but a virgin. And so it appears that somebody at some point had twisted the story round to fit in with what they imagined the old Jewish prophecies were all about. In fact, the word for a virgin in Hebrew was Betula, and that is not the word that is used in the Hebrew Old Testament. It's virgin. It's Alma, which means an unmarried woman. So I've got my suspicions about whether any of the events that portray Jesus' birth of a Virgin Mary are true at all. I think they were possibly added on later on.
And wasn't Mary herself born from a virgin mother?
No, it doesn't really say much about how she was born, but the early Christian tradition is her mother was Anna, or Anne, Saint Anne as she's called now, and she was married to a high priest of the temple. So she wasn't born of a virgin. She was born of a kind of temple maiden, somebody who looked after the altar in the temple, which, again, that's the early Christian tradition. But the early Christians were Greeks. They weren't Jews. The people who took up Jesus's teachings, first of all, were Greek people from outside of Palestine. And they were unfamiliar with the ancient Jewish traditions. And so when the story came about that Mary's mother had been a temple maiden, well, there may have been temple maidens in the Greek and Roman world, but there certainly wasn't in Jerusalem. Women were not allowed into the central temple complex in Jerusalem. So there was no such thing as a temple maiden, which again is another thing that seems to suggest that these accounts are written later and by people who had nothing to do with Jerusalem at the time that Jesus was around.
What was the point of writing it? To, like you said, was it to tell a story? Was it to teach a lesson?
I would imagine that what happened is that Jesus, I've little doubt that Jesus was an historical figure that was preaching around 30 AD. There are a couple of references outside the Bible that seem to refer to him. They may not, but they appear to. It actually, these Roman references refer to one Christos, and Christos is or Christus in Latin is the Latin version of the Greek Christos, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Messiah, which means anointed one. Now, when Jesus was preaching, his followers believed him to be the Messiah, or the Christos. But many other people at the same time also claimed to have been the Messiah. The Romans were very unpopular, and many people were coming along and saying, follow me and we'll get rid of the Romans. So there were a lot of Christoses, a lot of Christs kicking about at the time that Jesus was there. And the Roman writers, referring to the people following one Christos who was active in Jerusalem, may have been referring to one of these other messiahs, of which historians record quite a few, and many of them also claim to perform miracles. But the reason I think that Jesus, as we know it, as he is portrayed in the Bible, to some degree did exist, is that what's fascinating is that if you get the words of Jesus, the actual teachings of Jesus from the Bible, take them out, translate them back into Aramaic, which was the language spoken by people in and around Jerusalem at the time Jesus was arrived, by the ordinary people, Aramaic, which is language still spoken today. If you take Jesus' teachings like blessed are the peacemakers and so forth, or the Lord's Prayer, and you translate that back into Aramaic, the lines rhyme or have a rhythm to them, which suggests that these were words originally spoken by a preacher that were written in a way to be memorized by his followers and were passed down initially by word of mouth, which again gives credibility to the fact that Jesus, the preacher at least, did exist.
Post-crucifixion, what happened to Mary?
Okay, so
according to the Bible, of course.
We've got the birth of Jesus, and she's obviously kicking around at that point. But as I said, that may have just been made up later, especially when you have, for example, the situation where two of the Gospels that do mention the birth of Jesus both give a completely different date. We all imagine that Jesus was born in the year 1, and that's because later, much later on, after his lifetime, the Roman world decided to date, when they became Catholics, the beginning of the AD dating system from the point when Jesus was born. One of the Gospels tells us he was born just before the death of Herod the Great. Herod the Great, who was the king, the Roman-appointed king of Judea, in fact, all of Palestine at that point, Herod the Great died in 4 BC. So according to that account, Jesus was born 4 years before he is now thought to have been born. And yet in another account, these are both in Matthew and Luke's Gospels, another account, we are told that he was born at the time of a Roman census. Now, a particular census was carried out in the Roman Empire when everybody had to return to their homeland in order to be registered for taxation purposes. This happened in 6 AD. So there's a 10-year difference. Also, we all know the story of the 3 wise men and following the star and finding Jesus in a stable. Well, that's only one of the accounts. In the other account, we have Jesus being born in a house. There are no wise men, but there are shepherds and angels, but no star. And the account that mentions a star doesn't mention angels. And as I say, 2 of the accounts don't mention anything about Jesus' birth at all. So from the Bible itself, I think we can say it's probably unlikely that the events around Jesus' birth happened according to the way that they're portrayed. But in later period, Mary doesn't really come into the Bible that much. She appears 1 or 2 times as a kind of side figure, if you like. One occasion, Jesus virtually brushes her off when she tries to rebuke him for doing something. He says, let me alone, woman, sort of thing, or worse than an effect. But she is there present at the crucifixion. And the last we hear of her in the Bible itself is after Jesus has died, she is residing in a house with the disciples in Jerusalem. And that's it. We hear no more about her. The Acts of the Apostles, which is one of the books of the New Testament that takes up the story after Jesus' crucifixion, mentions something about her, and she's nothing else about her, and she's not mentioned in the letters of St. Paul. So as far as the Bible is concerned, we have no idea what happened to her.
How can there be such wildly different accounts of someone who's, I guess, considered such an important figure in Catholicism? How can there be such wildly different accounts even within?
Well, the Christian Church as we now know it, the Roman Catholic Church at least, wasn't founded until 325 AD on the orders of the Emperor Constantine the Great, Constantine III. He needed something to hold his empire together. He chose the religion of Christianity to do it because his mother, Helena, was already a Christian. But until then, from what little we do know of early Christian writings, Christianity was very different to what it later became. Most people were concerned about the teachings of Jesus, not the rituals involved, not going to church every Sunday, not ordained priests. And in fact, the early Christian church had many female priests. Women were leading the ceremonies that the early Christians were involved in as much as men. And in fact, the reason why Christianity basically spread so far and so quickly after Jesus' death is really because it appealed to two groups of people who were pretty much excluded from other religions: women and slaves. And the message of Christianity was that everybody is equal, everyone can worship together, and women were just as involved as men and led the congregations. This is what we know of early Christianity. But once the Roman Empire took it on in the early 300s, they formalized it all, and they had to try and bring in different ways in which people who were already following other religions in the Roman Empire wouldn't be too put off by this new state religion. And the Virgin Mary is one of these, an example of this. A lot of people throughout the Roman Empire worshipped the Egyptian goddess Isis, believe it or not, under various names. And in fact, the Greek world worshipped that same goddess, the fertility mother goddess, under the name, the Romans worshipped her as Diana, and the Greeks worshipped her as Artemis. So Isis, Artemis, and Diana were all big cult goddess figures in the Roman Empire. And so to try and get these people to become part of the Roman Catholic Church, and Catholic means universal, this new universal church of the Roman Empire, what they wanted to do was to make sure that people who had been worshipping this goddess would have something similar to worship within Christianity. And so this is where the cult of the Virgin Mary, if you like, or worship of the Virgin Mary, actually starts coming into it. I doubt if before this time, in the early 4th century, the Virgin Mary played a particular part in Christianity at all. It seems that it's after the Constantine's intervention that she starts being, statues of her begin to appear. And what is fascinating, and to show us that this is absolutely how it happened, one of the largest and most impressive temples in the whole ancient world was the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which is a huge Roman city, earlier than that, a Greek city on the coast of Turkey. And there, this Temple of Artemis was considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was huge. And there were statues there depicting Artemis on a crescent moon, standing on a crescent moon, because she was also the moon goddess. The Romans called her Diana, and she's represented in the same way. But once Christianity took over, the Temple of Artemis was stripped out and rededicated to the worship of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. and statues were put up of the Virgin Mary. Now, archaeologists digging there today, when they dig up a statue showing a woman standing on a moon, they don't know if it's Mary or Artemis until they really go into examining it, because Mary starts being depicted exactly as Artemis was depicted, standing on a moon. And in fact, when you very often see paintings from the medieval period of the Virgin Mary, you will see she is seated on or nearby a crescent moon. In other words, she takes over from Artemis.
One of the, I guess, tenets of Catholicism now is that Roman Catholics, at least, that they teach that Mary was assumed into heaven in bodily form, and so there's a big question of whether Mary is actually ever underwent physical death. Remains actually open in the Catholic view. So technically, an assumption is really just no one really knows. It's there's nothing to prove it.
There's nothing in the Bible about the assumption, and the assumption is her bodily ascension to heaven. In other words, Jesus is said to have ascended to heaven bodily, and she also is said to have ascended to heaven in a physical form, and that's called the assumption. But that isn't in the Bible. So until relatively recently, the Catholic Church left it up to the individual churchgoer to decide whether they believed that Mary was ascended bodily to heaven, or whether she died like any other mortal. Until 1950, when the Pope at the time decided that it was in fact canonical law, it was church doctrine that the Virgin Mary did ascend bodily to heaven. So anybody who'd kind of thought beforehand, well, I don't really accept that bit, it's not in the Bible, it was hard luck. If you were a loyal Catholic, you had to now believe that she'd ascended to heaven. Now, fair enough, for most people this didn't make much difference one way or the other. They'd always worshipped, or at least prayed to, statues of the Virgin Mary, and they'd said prayers to the Virgin Mary. That's fine, that didn't really change. But in Jerusalem, there was, in the valley of Jehoshaphat, there was and still is a shrine, a big church, which is said to be over the site of Mary's tomb. And it decked out absolutely fabulously with jeweled crosses and paintings and anything, just like something in the Vatican. It's an amazing place to visit. But the Catholic Church were always portraying this as the burial site of the Virgin Mary, and people were paying good money to go in and have a look at this thing. People would give gifts of money or other gifts to the church in order to be close to the place where Mary was thought, her bones were thought to have laid. And this had been going on for centuries. But now suddenly, the Pope had told the people running this place that this was no longer the tomb of the Virgin Mary. So they kind of had to sort of very quickly sort something out. What they did is they gave it over to the Greek Orthodox Church, who still believe that Mary actually was entombed there, and the place is still open, run by the Greek Orthodox Church. So very quickly the church had to distance itself from a place it had actually been making money out of for quite a time.
Now the tomb of Mary, that is where she died, and that's, I guess, where her burial place. And doesn't also Muslims believe this too?
I have I've never studied Islam. I believe that I have no idea what they think, to be quite honest. I've studied Christianity in considerable depth, but I'm afraid I know nothing about Islam at all. Yeah,
they believe the same as the Eastern Orthodox Catholics, that is where the burial, where she is buried, or at least that's where her final resting place was. So it just seems like a lot of people believe this certain thing. But in your book, The Marian Conspiracy, you claim that the Vatican secret archives contain some evidence of a covering up of concerning about the last days of Mother of Jesus Christ, and if that really is her place. Talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, the reason I called the book The Virgin Mary Conspiracy is because the conspiracy involved. In fact, when that book came out, the word conspiracy was not a dirty word today. In fact, two of my books have got the name conspiracy in them. There are other people who use the name conspiracy in the book. It wasn't a dirty word, but now conspiracy is like saying you've made it up. But anyway, the conspiracy involved in this case was a very genuine conspiracy that the church became embroiled in the 1950s. Now, I've mentioned how this tomb, when the Pope suddenly announced, okay, I've decided the Virgin Mary ascended to heaven, so they said, well, what are we going to do about this tomb? Of course, they gave it away to the Greek Orthodox Church. But that wasn't the end of it. They also had another place. There was another place that the church would have very often depict as the tomb of the Virgin Mary, and that was at Ephesus. Now, remember I said that Ephesus was this place where there was the temple of Artemis, which had then become a massive cathedral, if you like, in honor of the Virgin Mary. Well, the story built up around there that Mary had spent the last part of her life at Ephesus with the disciple Thomas, and when she died, she was buried there somewhere. And in fact, if you go to Ephesus today, you will see a little old cottage near to the old Roman city, which is said to be where the Virgin Mary lived. And a place there is said to be her tomb. So there wasn't just the one in Jerusalem that they had to consider. There was also this one at Ephesus. So what happened is there's an organization in the Vatican which is called it's a great big long name, and I very often forget it, but it's something like
it's like the doctrine
or something. It used to be called the Inquisition anyway.
It's never a good name for anything.
It's called anymore. It's been some years since I did this. But anyway, this group of people, top cardinals at the Vatican, decided what they needed to do was to look into the case of where the Virgin Mary was said to have been buried, to find out if there was any more tombs out there that they had to, if you like, brush under the carpet, or give away to the Orthodox Church. They wanted to really know what the situation was like, how many people were visiting various places claimed to be tombs of the Virgin Mary. And so this organisation, which starts off with the words the Holy Office, which was what was once the Inquisition, the Holy Office appointed a guy who worked at the Vatican in the museum. He was one of the Vatican archaeologists, to look into these cases and find out what is the case behind the tomb in Jerusalem and the case behind the tomb in Ephesus and so forth, and basically to come up with a good story to say, well, we don't think it's real anymore because historically this, that and the other, which would then kind of fit with the church pulling out of it, rather than saying, well, the Pope's told us not to believe in the Virgin Mary's tomb, so we don't have to do it anymore. They've actually got, hopefully, some kind of historical reason to say, we're terribly sorry, but we now know that she's not buried there. So this guy's job was to look into tombs of the Virgin Mary. He came back to the Vatican and said to them, guys, you don't have to worry about the tomb in the Valley of Jehoshaphat in Jerusalem. There's not a lot of historical evidence for it. And as for Ephesus, we can't actually pinpoint where Mary was supposed to be buried anyway. We've just got a little house she's supposed to have lived in, so that doesn't matter. Thank goodness, they said. But then he drops the bombshell, and that is, but I have found evidence for a third tomb. And they said, well, where's this then? Well, he'd found that there was evidence that the Virgin Mary was actually died and buried in Britain.
Where's the evidence for that part?
Well, the evidence comes from a pope himself, a pope that was considered the greatest pope of all Catholic history, Pope Gregory the Great. I'll come on to him in a moment, but there was early tradition, not in the Bible, but there were early Christian traditions that were written about as early as the 2nd century that we know for certain, that certain disciples, followers of Jesus, came to Britain. Now that might sound crazy. Britain's a long way away from the Middle East, but it isn't as mad as it sounds, because there were regular trade routes during the time of the Roman Empire between Palestine, along the coast around the Mediterranean, up round Spain, up across France to the north of France. And regular trading routes across the English Channel from France into Britain to cash in on the lucrative tin and copper mines that there were in Britain. So although Britain wasn't invaded by the Romans until 43 AD, at the time that Jesus died, around 32, around that kind of time, around that time, Britain was still outside the Roman Empire, but there was close ties with it, trading routes. Now, the story is that when the early Christians were persecuted in and around Jerusalem, they left, and some of them joined in with these trading expeditions and eventually settled in Britain. The reason why they settled here is because at that point it was still outside the Roman Empire. So they're not going to, if they just went off to somewhere else in the Roman Empire, they could find themselves unable to worship freely. So they went to Britain in the same way as those people on the Mayflower, the Pilgrim Fathers, went to America. I've never understood why they don't call them the Pilgrim Mothers as well, but there you go. It's the same thing. And one of the people who was supposed to have come to Britain is Joseph of Arimathea. Now, Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in the Bible. He's apparently the uncle of Jesus. It's him who organises Jesus's burial after he's dead, and then, of course, he rises from the tomb, according to the Bible. Now, early British traditions, many of them refer to Joseph of Arimathea coming to Britain. He's supposed to have ended up in Glastonbury in the west of Britain. And what happened is that a number of early stories in the British Isles refer to him in different locations. And when, so just bear that in mind, that there's this early tradition of Joseph of Arimathea and disciples coming to Britain. In the year 545, a British monk by the name of Gildas wrote about a tradition that existed in Britain at that time, that early followers of Jesus had settled in Britain and had even established a church. Well, it wouldn't be a church in the modern sense of the word, but a place of worship here. In the year 600, the Pope in Rome, or sorry, I think it was 597 or 8 to be precise, the Pope in Rome, Pope Gregory the Great, sent an envoy to Britain to try and convert the Anglo-Saxons to Catholicism. And this man's name was Augustine. He became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, the first Archbishop of the English Church. He wrote a letter to Pope Gregory in Rome, which still survives, not only in the Vatican, but is also in a number of English manuscripts. For example, a medieval manuscript written by the respected historian William of Malmesbury, written in the 1100s, in which he includes an extract from this letter, which basically says, in modern English, if you like, he's writing to Gregory the Great, and Augustine says, we're fine, I'm managing to convert the Anglo-Saxons, but I've found that in the west of Britain there are still Christians. There are people here who trace their Christian origins right the way back to the time of Christ. They say that disciples of Jesus came here. And what's more important, he tells us, he says that they believe that the Virgin Mary came here with Joseph of Arimathea, and that she died and was buried in the grounds of what is now a chapel on an island off the west coast of Britain. This is the damning evidence, if you like, that the archaeologists found and reported back to the Holy Office.
Because if it's part of the Vatican's secret archives, no one's going to be able to see this document. I mean, how do we know that it really exists outside of people, almost becoming a telephone game in a sense?
Well, what we can go with is the historian William of Malmesbury in 1130 compiled a history of Britain, and in this history he includes this letter. That is where we actually know it from. The archaeologist who was sent to investigate the Virgin Mary's tombs makes reference to the extract in William of Malmesbury's history, But he also says, when he was freely writing to people before they shut him up, that we have the original letter in the archives of the Vatican. So we have his word for the fact that the same letter that is in William of Malmesbury's account does exist in the Vatican.
And they would want to suppress it because this goes against a basic tenet or Catholic dogma of the Assumption.
Well, this is when the suppression comes in. Okay, he comes up with a good reason to say, well, it's only a matter of faith that the Virgin Mary was buried in this place in Jerusalem. I mean, there's no real historical evidence for it. There's no real historical evidence for any kind of tomb in Ephesus. But the problem is, he said that there is historical evidence certainly by the 600s, people in Britain who weren't supposed to be Christian in the western part of Britain there was a community of people who traced themselves all the way back to the earliest Christians and said that the Virgin Mary herself had come there. Now, the reason why this now was a much greater threat to the papacy than the story simply of the Virgin Mary not going to heaven is that the papacy, but the Pope, and the Catholic Church is all about the apostolic succession. That means that Jesus gave St. Peter the power to be the leader of the church after his death, according to the Bible. He then gave it to somebody else, who gave it to somebody else, who, according to Catholic doctrine, passed it all the way down to the modern popes. So the Pope himself, the reason he is infallible in the eyes of everybody and in the eyes of God is because he is directly spiritually descended from the first disciples. Well, what this guy, archaeologist, had found out is there was early historical evidence for the fact there was a completely separate apostolic succession. Other disciples had come to Britain, and they included the Virgin Mary, and they'd started a church here. In other words, it was suggesting there was another church with equal right to claim itself as the true Church of God beside the Roman Catholic Church. That is when a friendly archaeologist has to be quietened.
Don't you find it interesting or intriguing that it took 600 years for any documentation to come out?
No, not really. The thing is that what we have to remember is when the Roman Empire collapsed in the 400s, the Western Roman Empire, excuse me, what happened is that many places throughout Europe, particularly in Britain, fell into a state of anarchy. Small kingdoms grew up and people started fighting each other all over the place. It's a period we know as the Dark Ages. But it wasn't just that most of Europe was in a state of anarchy that stopped things being written. It was also, to write, you have to have a pen and ink and paper. We take it for granted. Well, we don't so much anymore because we do everything on computer. But we take that sort of thing for granted. But to make paper that you can properly write on without it smudging, ripping, falling apart is quite a complicated process, and you need a manufacturing base to do it. The Roman Empire had this. Once the Roman Empire had gone, people weren't creating good paper anymore. And as for making ink, most people were trying to write with charcoal, and that ends up fading very quickly. So for reasons like this, very few records were actually kept from the collapse of the Roman Empire onwards, and those that did exist were being destroyed, rotting away, not kept in good conditions in libraries because civilization had fallen apart. So there may have been many other earlier references to this that no longer survive. It's miraculous, really, that this letter, and miraculous, really, that the work of the monk Gildas, who refers to these early Christians coming here, still survived. In fact, there's only a handful of Dark Age manuscripts from this country, for example, from Britain, that do survive.
A miracle indeed, maybe a Christmas miracle. Let's take a break right there just for a few moments. When we come back with Graham Phillips, we're going to talk about who the real Jesus Christ was, who the real mother of Jesus Christ was, and where she was buried and the clues that led him there. We'll be right back on The Mind's Eye. We're back with Graham Phillips, and we're celebrating Christmas, talking about his exploration from the book The Marian Conspiracy. And we were talking how he found, or talking about these documents that change our view of Jesus Christ and Virgin Mary. So, what do these documents say? They not only do they say that she was buried somewhere else, what else do they teach us or show us differently about her life, and then, of course, Jesus' life?
Well, they don't really tell us much about her life at all. But what we can do is look completely outside Christian tradition into the work of an historian by the name of Josephus, a Jewish historian who was alive in the late part of the 1st century. In other words, he was alive at the time when people may still have been alive that actually knew Jesus, or at least knew people from Jerusalem at the time that Jesus was supposed to have lived. Josephus tells us about somebody that could have been the Virgin Mary. Now, remember, according to early Christian tradition, she's supposed to have been the daughter of the high priest of the temple. Now, if we say that, remember I said earlier that there are 2 possible dates for Jesus' birth according to the Gospels, but as most people tend to associate it with Herod the Great, let's go with that date, which means Jesus had to have died before what we now call 4 BC, because that's when Herod died. He died at old age, basically, but he was going a bit crazy in his old age, and apparently what he did, according to Josephus, in his writing, and Josephus wasn't a Christian writer, he was simply writing a history of the Jews. What Herod did was he actually went round ordering the death of babies, newborn babies. Now, if we remember from the account in the Bible, Herod is supposed to have found out from the wise men that Jesus had been born, that he might grow up to become king of the Jews. And terrified by this, Herod ordered that all the babies in the area that are newborn be killed, so that this child couldn't grow up to threaten his rule. That's the story in the Bible anyway. Well, historically, Herod did order the deaths of babies, but it had nothing to do with Jesus as we know him. It was so that he could find the child of one of his sons. Now, he, according to Josephus, had a son called Antipater. You're actually probably thinking that those names don't sound very Hebrew. They weren't, in fact, Greeks. They were Greek Jews who ruled Palestine at this point. So Antipater, he is the son and heir of Herod. He was a close friend of Augustus Caesar, the Roman emperor at the time. And the Roman Emperor Augustus said that because Herod was ruling Judea as a puppet king, if you like, for the Romans, and the person who was to follow him, according to Augustus's decree, was Antipater. Now, Antipater had fallen out with Herod, and what happened is that Herod, as I said, was going a bit nuts because he went against went against Caesar himself and decided to have his son Antipater murdered. He had him arrested, put in a cell, and murdered him with his own bare hands in his cell. What happened then is that Herod discovered that Antipater had a son, a newborn baby. Now, according to the decree by Augustus, Antipater was the heir to Herod. And if Antipater should die, then his eldest son would be heir to Herod. Now, Herod, an old man, wanted his son Philip to become his heir. He got rid of Antipater, but there was still Antipater's baby son kicking around somewhere, and it was him that Herod sent out the soldiers to try to kill. So we know that Herod really was trying to kill babies at the time around when Jesus is said to have been born, according to one of the Gospels anyway. And we're also told, of course, that that Herod tries to find the baby Jesus. Could there have been a connection between these two things? What's fascinating is that we don't know what the son of Antipater was called, but we do know his mother's name. His mother, who had married Antipater, was called Mariamne. Mariamne is the Greek version of Miriam. Because remember I said these were Greek Jews. The Hebrew name for Mariamne is Miriam. The modern English version of that is Mary. So Mariamne means Mary. So there is a baby whose mother was called Mary that Herod is trying to kill at exactly the same time as, according to the Bible, Herod is trying to kill Jesus, the son of Mary. I think they're one and the same.
I can see why part of it would be covered up, but doesn't that somewhat fulfill the prophecy that of Jesus coming and being King of the Jews? I mean, a real heir to the throne of being King of Judea. I mean, doesn't that fulfill part of the prophecy?
Precisely, and this is probably what was so dangerous about it. If we skip forward a bit to, 30 years or so, to when Jesus is preaching, he is arrested for preaching, for basically going into the temple, turning over all these tables, smashing the place up and saying that the people in the temple in Jerusalem are blasphemers, they're just trying to make money at it, and so on and so forth. Jesus has gone too far. He's preached against the priesthood in the temple, saying that they're not worthy of of being priests, if you like. So they arrest him. The Sanhedrin arrest him. That is the council of the high priests in Jerusalem, and he is arrested on a religious crime. Now, the way that the law worked in Jerusalem at the time is matters of political matters were dealt with by the Romans, but anything religious matters were just left up to the local people. The Sanhedrin had the power to sort that out. Now, technically speaking, the Sanhedrin had the right to have Jesus executed straight away, and the form of execution that they used wasn't crucifixion, it was stoning to death. People just put somebody in a pit and threw stones at them until they died, basically. Now, they could have done that. They had the power to do that. Who would have cared? But for some reason, we're told, the Sanhedrin try and get permission from Pilate, Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman military governor in Jerusalem, in order to have Jesus executed, which kind of doesn't make sense of the historical situation of law in Jerusalem at that time. But anyway, he goes to Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate will only find him guilty if he's guilty of sedition or plotting against Rome. Now, he goes to, the crime he's accused of, and we know this, is claiming to be king of the Jews. We know this is what he was accused of because it says so, and also because this is the plaque that was nailed on the cross above his head when he was executed. It says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In other words, that is the crime he was executed for. But when he first goes to see Pilate, Pilate reports back to the Sanhedrin and says, I find no wrong in him at all. He's not guilty. But Jesus had basically said to Pilate, I am the King of the Jews. So how can Pilate find no guilt in him, claiming to be that? That's sedition, isn't it? Unless, of course, he really was the King of the Jews. In other words, regardless of what Pilate or the Sanhedrin thought, if the son of Antipater really had survived the attempt by Herod to have him killed, and he grew up and in some way could prove that he was the son of Antipater, then the law said he was the King of the Jews under Roman jurisdiction, only answerable to the emperor himself, who by this time was Tiberius, the successor of Augustus. But Augustus's law, that had actually stated all this in the first place, could not be undone by Tiberius or anybody else, because Augustus, after his death, had been made by the Senate a god. So any decree made by the god Augustus could not be undone. So even Tiberius couldn't decide, the new emperor couldn't say that a proven son of Antipater should not be the king of Jerusalem, the king of what's now Israel, Palestine. So it seems to me that the only way that Pilate in reality could have found that Jesus was not guilty and could find no fault in him was if he had good evidence to think that he was the king of the Jews. Wow. And in fact, if he was Antipater's son, the son of Mariamne, Mary, then he would have had the right to say he was king of the Jews.
And this changes so much of what we know. I mean, right off the bat, there's no way that Virgin Mary wouldn't exactly exist the way that we're told. She wouldn't be a virgin.
Jesus really was the son of Antipater, no. But what ultimately, of course, Jesus was executed by Pilate, because we're told that the Jews were starting to riot, and if he didn't have Jesus executed, there would be a lot of trouble, and he washed his hands of the matter and basically said, okay, you want him dead, I'll do it, but be it on you. We know from historically, I mean, Pontius Pilate was an historical figure, and we know from records at the time he was a particularly brutal Roman governor who didn't care a damn about what the priesthood of the Jews thought about anything. He wouldn't have done anything to placate them. He'd have just sent the troops out and had them all arrested if he wanted. No, he decided to wash his hands of the matter and have them executed and sort of say, right, okay, it's on your head, be it, because he knew that perhaps he had to do this to stop a riot, but ultimately he was breaking the commands of the god Augustus, who had decreed that this man really was the king of the Jews. That's my theory anyway.
And this is pretty much where your quest, the actual physical quest in itself, comes into play. You went looking for the possible final burial place and the final resting place of Mary, which you believe is in England. Tell us about that quest and what led you there and what actually happened.
Well, I thought one of the only ways to actually prove that Mary actually did really come to Britain is to find her grave. And going back to this letter that Augustine, the first Archbishop of Canterbury in the late 500s, wrote to Pope Gregory, it tells us that it describes the island as being a large island, the kind of things that grow there, and its location on the west of Britain. There's only one place that actually matches the description of where Mary is thought to have lived and died, and that is an island off the coast of Wales, off the west coast of Britain, called Anglesey. It's the largest of the British Isles, the largest island off the coast of Britain. And there, in the middle of the island of Anglesey, there is a small parish church called St Mary's Church. Now, records show that this was a St Mary's Church over 1,500 years ago. So it was actually there in Roman times. Sadly, because of what I said about the collapse of the Roman Empire, there are no records going back earlier than that. But you'd say, okay, there's a St Mary's Church in the middle of the island. Well, what's that mean? Well, to start off with, places by the name of St Mary's associated with them in the west of Britain, Wales, are few and far between. But if you've got a place that's associated with a saint going back 1,500 years, that means more than the name of a saint. Today, if a church is consecrated to a saint, St Michael, St Peter's, or whatever, it's simply named after a saint for, shall we say, ceremonial purposes. But going back 1,500 years, the reason why churches were named after saints is because they were thought to contain the body or the bones of the saint that was inside the church. In other words, they were the place where the person was buried, or their bones were. And in other words, if this is a St Mary's Church in the middle of Anglesey 1,500 years ago, then that church was thought then to have been a place where the Virgin Mary's bones were kept, else it wouldn't have been called St Mary's back then. Now, we know that according to this letter that Augustine sent to the Pope, that Mary is said to have been buried there in a church that was founded right back at the time then she lived. Now, I can't see it would have been a church in the way that we would imagine it today, but a place of worship. So perhaps, and it's only just a possibility, the church, which is now called St Mary's, stands on the spot where an early chapel once stood, where the Virgin Mary was thought to have been laid to rest. So I've actually got to a specific location where the Virgin Mary may well have ultimately her tomb. And what is interesting, there's a local tradition that just outside the churchyard there's a spring, a beginning of a little brook, a little creek, and there's a spring where water wells up from the ground, and there's an old holy well there. It's called St. Mary's Well. And the tradition is that this is a local tradition, and this is incredible, that this should still exist in local folklore, that once the Virgin Mary came to England and drank from this well. And I said to the local people, do you believe she came here? They said, oh yes, we've always believed the Virgin Mary came here. And I'm thinking, hold on a minute, I've been doing all this research, and local people think that the Virgin Mary is associated with this place already, but they never told anybody outside the village. And the local tradition is that she was actually buried beside this little spring. And I had the area surveyed by geophysics equipment. That's stuff like ground penetrating radar, which produces a three-dimensional computer image of what lies buried beneath the soil. And there is a grave there, and there is a skeleton there, but unfortunately the ground is too acidic, and the bones have become almost part of the soil themselves, and we can't do anything to determine really how old this skeleton is, or who it might belong to. But it's a nice ending to the story, however, that I've got a place where all my research has led me to where the Virgin Mary might have been buried, and the people who live there already thought she was buried there.
Happy accident that you fell into. I think local folklore says a lot. I mean, was there any type of inscription or something that says or designates that, hey, this is where she was buried?
Yes, and that's what I found really fascinating. And it wasn't something that was really visible. Hidden away in some trees just behind this spring, there was a stone. And carved on this stone, like a headstone of a grave, carved on this stone was a strange glyph or symbol. And I looked at it and I thought, wonder what that means. And somebody that I was with at the time, helping me do my research, said, that looks like the symbol that they use for the constellation Virgo in astrology. I said, oh really? And I looked at it, I said, oh my goodness, it is. It's the symbol for the star constellation Virgo. And then I thought, oh, Virgo is supposed to be a virgin. Hold on, is this telling us that this is where the Virgin, or at least in Christian tradition, the Virgin was buried? We have no idea why this stone was put there, but it does seem that somebody had put a sign of the Virgin, if you like, on a headstone in that area at some time over the years. And when I first wrote about this, the people from the local museum decided that this stone could easily be dug up and taken away. So it has been removed from where it was, and it's now on display at the museum at Lanark Med, which is in the middle of Anglesey. It's the Anglesey Island Museum. And if anybody wants to go along there, you can go in and you can still see this headstone. And
does the museum claim that this is the Virgin Mary headstone, or they just...
No, they claim that Graham Phillips claims it.
And that's as good as gold, in my opinion.
Well, that's as good as I'm going to get, I think.
You wrote this book about, I don't know, I guess maybe about 10 years ago or so. Do you still believe it? I mean, because you're a very good journalist. If you are presented new evidence, you're willing to take it there and change your opinion. This is about 10 years later. I mean, do you still firmly believe this is where she's buried, or have you changed your opinion at all?
No, I haven't changed it at all. Everything I've just said is how I thought about it then and how I think about it now. I've got no reason to change anything yet. But then again, this book has never got very much publicity. Probably because people thought, oh no, we can't go around saying that the church has covered something up. I don't know why. I mean, most of my books have got a tremendous amount of publicity, but this is actually the first interview I've ever done about it. I've done a couple of interviews for newspapers that came out at the time when the book was published, like 10 or 12 years ago, whenever it was. And but I've never done a radio interview or a talk about this or anything until now. This is the first time. First talk I've ever, first time I've ever spoken about it.
Are you a practicing Catholic? I mean, how do you feel about this personally? I don't know if you are or you're not, but I mean,
it's an interesting story. I got excommunicated.
After this, or beforehand, or was this a cherry on top?
When this book came out, as I say, it got some publicity in the newspapers, and one of those newspapers was a leading paper in Italy, in Rome. The whole headline about "Man in England claims that the Virgin Mary is buried there," or whatever, and quite a few schools, Catholic schools in England, started having heard about this, started ordering this book for their library as kind of, oh, here's some interesting stuff about history. Now, the Catholic Church, in order to, very often produces a list, I think it's on a monthly basis, of books that are pretty much banned from Catholic institutions, schools, monasteries, or whatever. In other words, if you're a good Catholic, you don't go and read this book. And my book happened to be on the list, with a load of other books, no doubt. I wasn't singled out or anything. Oh, we can't have that, we can't have that. We can't have this in schools. But technically speaking, in order to ban the book of somebody, just like in the case of Galileo centuries ago, they had to excommunicate him first in order that his book was then considered a heresy. But of course, he was a Catholic. I wasn't a Catholic, but apparently I discovered when some journalist from this Italian newspaper called me up and said, "Do you realise you've been excommunicated?" I said, "What?" They said, "Yeah, the latest list is your book's on this ban list, which means you've been excommunicated by the Pope as part of a kind of mass excommunication every month." I said, "I'm not even communicated. I'm not religious." And he said, "Well, you can't become, if you decide to become religious, you've got no chance now." So apparently, as far I'm not even supposed to be allowed into Catholic churches. I don't know if it means I'm going to burn up if I go inside them, or they'll throw me out. But anyway, so yes, I'm excommunicated, but I don't even believe in. I don't know what I believe. I'm not a religious person who goes to church anyway.
We would never excommunicate you here on this show, my friend.
Thank you very much.
Now, did you get a letter in the mail saying you were excommunicated?
No,
like a signed letter from the Pope?
No, I would have framed it. I'd have put it on my website. But no, it just appears in some newspaper in Rome every month. They have a list of excommunicants. I
would have pinned it to my jacket and just worn it out everywhere I go, letting everybody see. That's a badge of honor, in my opinion. At
least the Pope knows who I am, I suppose, or did, the Pope at the time.
I think, that's an accomplishment in itself. God bless you. How about that? Is that the right time?
They basically, in the end, what they did with Galileo is to forgive him, and he's now recommunicated. So who knows? 300 or 400 years after I die, I might get recommunicated. All
right, well, fair enough. It doesn't sound like you're missing out on much. Now, do I got you for a few more minutes to talk about another holy relic?
Indeed, you can.
I appreciate that. Now, another holy relic that possibly ended up in England is the Holy Grail. Now, tell us about that search, and of course, give us a little summation of what the Holy Grail is, and then tell us a little bit about your search for it.
Basically, the Holy Grail, I remember I talked earlier about Joseph of Arimathea, who was supposed to have come to Britain with certain disciples. The story, the old tradition in Christian tradition is that Joseph of Arimathea brought the cup that was used by Jesus at the Last Supper to Britain with him. And he actually used this cup to collect a few drops of Christ's blood on the cross. And thereafter, anybody who drank from this vessel would be cured of all ills or become immortal in some versions of the tale. But that became known as the Holy Grail. But that was the one that was taken up in all the later Arthurian stories of King Arthur's knights searching for the Holy Grail. But in the early period, with going back to about 300 AD, there was two versions of the Grail story. They both concerned cups which had been used to collect Christ's blood, but the second one was said to have been a small jar, a perfume jar, ointment jar, used by Jesus' female follower, Mary Magdalene, to collect a few drops of Christ's blood while he was on the cross. And she is supposed to have come to Britain with that in some early tales. And that then becomes the Holy Grail. That is something, if you drink from it, you can be cured of all ills. Now, I've managed to discover in England there is a place called Whittington, a town called Whittington, and there's a castle that dates back to the Middle Ages called Whittington Castle, also known as the White Castle because it's built from light-coloured limestone. And in that particular town, the very earliest Grail stories are set. It's said to be where the Grail was kept and eventually sought by King Arthur and his knights. It's only a legend, but it does associate itself with a real castle and a real town. We are told that the Grail was found by King Arthur's knights in the White Town, in a place called the White Castle. Well, Whittington is Old English for White Town, so it seems that that's where the story was set. But remarkably, in the 1200s, there was a baron who lived at this White Castle. It was his castle, and he actually claimed to have possessed the Grail, but the Grail he claims to have possessed was not the cup of the Last Supper associated with Joseph of Arimathea, but the perfume jar said to have been made of green alabaster that Mary Magdalene was said to have used to collect Christ's blood. So that was the Grail that I decided to go in search of, this particular, because I actually had a place and I actually had a family who claimed to have possessed it.
How would it have ended up in their hands? How would it have gone from the Holy Land to then England?
Well, I don't think it actually had anything to do with directly Mary Magdalene coming over here and bringing it with her. We know that when Constantine the Great, the Roman Emperor, made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire in 325 AD, he founded what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church. His mother, the Empress Helena, went off to Jerusalem to collect holy relics, things that were supposed to have been associated with Christ and the royal and the Holy Family during their lifetimes. She apparently collected nails that were supposed to have driven through Christ's hands and feet at the Crucifixion, parts of the splinters from the original cross, and various other relics like this. But one thing she came back with was said to be the what's known as the alabaster jar, the cup used by Mary Magdalene, which was apparently found in some tomb somewhere in Jerusalem. Or maybe it was just some guy decided to palm her off with this thing and say, yeah, this belonged to Mary Magdalene. She gave him loads of money for it. But there certainly was a cup claimed to be the cup of Mary Magdalene, which was in what later became the Vatican at St. Peter's in Rome. Now, when the Roman Empire when Rome was eventually sacked in 410 AD by the Visigoths, a convoy of carts left Rome and took out of Rome all the, if you like, the crown jewels belonging to the emperors, plus a load of other holy relics that they considered important. And because they thought at that point that the whole of the Western Roman Empire was about to fall, these were taken to the one part of the Roman Empire which they hoped would survive longer, which was across the sea in Britain. And they were taken to the town, which was the principal city in England at the time, or Britain at the time, which is called Viraconium, which is just outside a modern town of Shrewsbury in the centre of England. Now, so we definitely have a possibility that a cup thought to belong to Mary Magdalene, i.e. a Grail, did end up in the centre of Britain. Whether it actually did belong to Mary Magdalene, who knows? But there is a cup with that supposed provenance in the centre of Britain. The family who then later owned this area around the Roman city of Viraconium were the same family who later built the castle just a few miles away at Whittington, and they were the people who claimed to have possessed the cup in the Middle Ages. So there is a direct provenance linking a cup thought to belong to Mary Magdalene coming from Jerusalem all the way to this family at Whittington in the Middle Ages.
And how did you get turned on to the story did they just come out and say, hey, we got this cup? I mean, how did you find out about this?
Oh, no, I mean, this family had basically, the last one of them, there was a guy called Thomas Wright, who still lived near where this town of Whittington is, in the county of Shropshire in England. He was the last one of this family, the direct descendants, father, son, etc., because it was just a male thing. He didn't have anyone to hand it on to, daughters or sons. And when he died, he decided to hide this thing and leave his series of clues as to where it was. Now, quite why he did this, who knows? Maybe he thought of himself as some kind of latter-day Merlin. But whatever he did this for, he claimed to still have this cup. He claimed to have hidden it. He wrote a book that he said was full of all sorts of clues as to where it was. So I thought, okay, I'll have a look at this book. I mean, maybe he really did hide something. I'd love to get my hands on this thing and find out how old it really is. Cutting a very long story short, the clues in this book ultimately led to a stained glass window that he'd paid to have installed in a church, which had clues that led to a statue that he'd had put in these caves in a place called Hawkstone Park, a parkland surrounding a large mansion that belonged to his friend. Inside this, at the base of this statue of an eagle, in the 1920s, a small green stone cup was found. Now, in fact, the person who found the cup in this base of this statue wasn't in fact following the clues. He did it by accident. He decided he wanted this statue. He bought it off the landlord at that time, was going to move it to his own garden, but as he was lifting it up with tackle and winching equipment or whatever, the ropes broke and the thing fell and the base broke open, and they found this little recess in there, little compartment in which this stone cup was found. Everyone thought it was a bit odd that there should be a stone cup in it, but when I read about this, I thought, oh wow, it's probably been thrown away. This could be the Holy Grail, the cup of Mary Magdalene. But luckily, this guy's great-great-granddaughter still had it. It was in her loft, and I actually went round to her house, and she said, you've still got that thing. We don't know what it is, probably some kind of old mustard pot or egg cup or something. I said, well, can I have a look at it? And it was still wrapped up in old newspaper up in the attic. And literally it looked like an egg cup. It was about, 3 inches high and about 2 inches wide, shaped like an egg cup and made of green stone that was obviously pretty old. So I had it taken to the British Museum, and when I turned up, I didn't say, is this a grail or what? I didn't. All I simply said was, I've got this cup, this little thing, and it's been found under unusual circumstances. What would you think it was? And they immediately said, that looks like a Roman scent jar. Now that's exactly what Mary Magdalene's alabaster cup was supposed to be. And the Bible refers to it as a cup in which she had the scent spikenard, which she was going to take to anoint Jesus' body when he was going to be laid in the tomb. But later she used it to fill it with his blood, according to the tradition. But it's mentioned in the Bible as this alabaster cup. So I thought, wow, so it is old. Okay, it could really be the thing that was found by the Empress Helena, as some people call her. So, okay, and what else could, they actually took me to a gallery where there was a number of other cups that looked exactly like this, except they had lids to them as well. And they said this would have originally had a lid, but obviously that's gone missing over the years. And they looked exactly the same, and they dated from like 2,000 years ago. And I said, have you any idea where it came from? And after a while, they said, well, by the type of stone, the alabaster, green onyx, as it's called, that it's made from, it looks as though it possibly came from the area around Palestine. And it's around about 2,000 years old. 2,000 years old? Palestine? That's exactly the period Mary Magdalene and Jesus are said to have lived. So, I don't know, maybe it's all a great big coincidence, but it certainly was a fascinating quest.
Did you actually do any scientific testing on it to get the date, or just from the museum people, they just by looking at it, they were able to tell.
They could, and sadly, they could only determine what it was by looking at it. They basically, it's pretty certain that the kind of alabaster that it's made from, it actually comes from the Negev desert in southern Israel. So, I probably haven't said the name of the desert right, have I? But anyway, the desert in southern Israel. So there's little doubt that is where it comes from. The date is only possible because of the style. You see, you can't carbon date anything which isn't organic matter, like bone or the wood. You can carbon date that. You can find out when it died, but you can't do that with stone. There are ways of determining how long a stone has been in place. But of course, this had been inside, outside, moved around. It wasn't, as they call it, in situ. So there's no way of absolutely being certain that it dates from 2,000 years ago.
And if it would have collected Jesus' blood, I mean, obviously 2,000 years later, I can't imagine there being any traces or remnants, but was there any staining, anything to indicate that there was something in there, maybe even blood? I mean, could you get the DNA? I mean, what, did you find anything in that regard?
Unfortunately, no. But that was one of the first things that we actually had done, and that it's been, moved around and kept in various families for so long. And in fact, they said, the museum said when they first looked at it, they said it looks like it was on display at some point, because around the lid, the lip of the cup, there is indentations, and they said that happens when people touch things over many, many years, because the sweat on your fingers is slightly acidic. Over the years, it actually wears stone away over many years. So they think it might have been on display as a holy item, and people touched it. So unfortunately, there's no chance of going back to some original DNA on it.
And don't you think you're a bit of a homer, Graham? I mean, we got Mary buried in England. We got the Holy Grail, and one of some of the most important relics and people. They're all buried there. Don't you think you're a bit of a nationalist or a bit of a homer here?
No, because I started off going to Israel, and both of these quests, I went through Turkey to places like Ephesus. I went all the way around the Vatican, and a number of occasions I was bothering the Vatican. I went all the way around Europe before I ended up back in my own backyard. It's just weird. People have said that to me. Well, how come it always ends up back where you are? I have no idea. And if the next thing I investigate ends up in my own backyard, I'm going to look rather silly. But it keeps happening. I don't understand it. But I just see that the central Britain, one of the reasons for it is that Britain, it's to do with its position outside the Roman Empire. Remember that Mary and other early disciples may have fled to Britain because it was outside the Roman Empire, but still civilized enough to still be a place where you could settle. If you went into somewhere like, crossed the Rhine and went into the Germanic states, into Germanic areas, which were not part of the Roman Empire, you'd probably have your head lopped off or be turned into a slave. But in Britain, they already had trading relations with Britain. So it's a place you could go outside the Roman Empire and be safe. And then, of course, later on, when the Roman Empire collapsed, Britain was across the sea and was considered a safe place from the barbarian invasions to take important and sacred objects. So that's probably why Britain is the place where these things all ended up.
Now, supposedly the Holy Grail has miraculous healing powers. It could possibly give eternal life for those who drink from it. I got to know, Graham, did you drink from it? Did you pour a little water in there and then take a big swig?
Yes, I have, actually. And I've got a cold now, so it obviously doesn't make you have no ills, but I haven't died yet. So that's all I can say.
That is very reassuring.
We can do an interview if you're still alive.
I sure hope so. I didn't drink from it, so I probably don't have as much time as you, but I'm sure we can squeeze in a couple more interviews. I want to take a drink from it, then me and you can be doing these interviews every 6 months for God knows how long. All right. You don't have to say you will. It's okay. I'm not offended. It's fine.
Well, you can get to drink from it. I don't know. Whereabouts exactly are you?
I'm in Los Angeles, actually. So
I'm coming over there next year, so I'll bring it with me.
Yeah, make sure it doesn't go through the airport. You might want to hold that one close to you. They break everything around here.
Smuggling artifact.
What's next on the list? You're going to be doing this Ark of Covenant for a while, you think?
Yeah, I'm working on that. I've actually managed to trace it to where I believe it might be, but it's the place where it might be now is beneath a chapel that's now owned by the Freemasons. So I'm starting to get involved with their stuff, and it'll be the first time I've ever got involved with the Freemasons. I don't know anything about them, but the ones I've met so far are very friendly and helpful.
And, well, I'm a Freemason myself, so I'm more than happy to help you there in any way that I can. I don't know what else I don't know what I can do, but more than happy to give you anything from my perspective as one.
I shall bear that in mind.
And no, we're not trying to take over the world, as I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Oh, no. My book will not include anything to do with Freemason conspiracies. I'm just looking at the symbolism in this church to find out what symbolism is a bit out of place amongst normal Masonic symbolism that might relate to where a previous Mason had hidden what could have been the Ark of the Covenant.
And can I take one guess? It might be in England?
Yeah, it is.
Excellent.
It's getting nuts. I mean, I'm beginning to sound like I'm just making all this stuff up, but seriously, it all ends up back here.
All right, give out your social media information one last time before I let you go for the evening.
Okay, well, the book that's all about what I've been talking about is in America, it's the Virgin Mary conspiracy. The other book, which is all about the Grail, is called The Chalice of Magdalene. My website is grahamphillips.net. You go on the first page, you'll see all my books there. Just click on one of those and it gives you plenty of pages to read all about them without ever having to buy them. And if you please feel free to join my Facebook, which is Graham Phillips Author. That is to separate me from any other Graham Phillips. There's hundreds of them out there. Graham Phillips Author, that's my Facebook.
Excellent. And, of course, we have the links up on our side as well. And, Graham, I really appreciate giving us a slice of your time. And I know, especially because you're a little bit under the weather now as well.
Thank you very much indeed.
I hope you have a wonderful Christmas, and I will talk to you soon. Stay warm by the fire.
Will do.
Mind's Eye Show wrap up when we return. We're back on the Mind's Eye wrap up. Another fantastic one in the books. Truly highly urge you to check out Graham's work. Really thought-provoking stuff. But this is not just any Mind's Eye Show wrap-up. It's our holiday break wrap-up. And what does that mean? Well, really not much, to tell you the truth, except for we're going to be on a bit of an extended break until you hear our next new show. We might pop up before then, but most likely it's going to be about 6 weeks from now.